Hello and welcome to what used to be the Sunday night self-care session has now moved to the Monday night self-care session. Thank you so much for being on here with me. My name is Stephanie Burton. This is Project Glow, and the topic of this evening's 1 hour roundabout Facebook Live is the spiritual purpose of relationships. Now, before you think I'm going to spend 45 minutes going on about some very woo-woo kind of topic, there is a bit of woo in there, but mostly it is the answer to a question that I got from a lovely, lovely client of mine that said, after having broken up with a relationship and the person in question had left her, she said, why on earth was I in that relationship, especially because it was so good at the time, and why did it break up? I just don't understand. Now, without going into the absolute detail of why relationships break down, because obviously there's communication issues, there'll be intimacy issues, there'll be compatibility issues, there'll be communication issues. What I'm looking at tonight is the spiritual purpose of relationships. And that's why also, to answer the question of why did it end, is because the purpose was done. So let's move away from the kind of more detailed approach to exactly why did it break down. I want to raise your awareness tonight and look at it from a higher perspective and say, okay, from a soul perspective, from a heart perspective, from an overview perspective, what is the purpose of a relationship? And if you want to join me in that, you can look at what was the purpose of a relationship you were in. Perhaps also what is the purpose of the relationship you are in now. But as I said, it's particularly poignant to answer the question of why was I in that relationship and why, if it was so good at one stage, did it end? So I wrote some lovely notes tonight. You'll see there's a lot. Don't worry, I'm not covering it all tonight. I've split it into two sections. So tonight what I'm going to do is the spiritual purpose of relationships, and there are 8 points. And next Monday night I'm going to do the emotional lessons. The emotional lessons. So it's both the purpose and the lessons in relationship. Because every single relationship that you've ever been with or in has brought you a message, a lesson, a blessing, and a gift. So, but let's start at the very, very top of it all. The main, and I'm going to repeat this so it really kind of gets infused into your mind. The spiritual purpose of a relationship is to connect two people to relive the wound of their childhood with the knowledge and the wisdom of the adult mind. So I'm going to say it again. The purpose, the spiritual purpose of a relationship is to combine and bring together two people to work through and live through and go through the emotional wound of their childhood from the perspective and the wisdom of their adult self. The big problem with that is most of us, when we get into a relationship, to clear out and to address that childhood wound, that inner core wound, we just regress into, well, you guessed it, children. So actually, for most of us, unless we've been trained, unless we've been schooled, there just is no chance that you can even step into a new relationship as an adult with the wisdom and understanding of an adult, because the core wound of your childhood is so profound and so strong. Just it's in every day of your life. It's just such a subconscious programming. But at the same time, the universe has purpose in that it wants you to go onto the journey, and that is a huge learning journey, going through the journey of relationships. Because of course, relationships and the universe is very, very brilliant at that. It pumps up all the right chemicals into your body that you get completely and utterly attracted to exactly the right person. And most of the time, in fact, almost all the time, you will be attracted to somebody with exactly the same core wound as you, with the opposite expression of it. So the purpose of a relationship from a spiritual perspective is for you to relive that wound, but not just to be in a state of pain, but for you to move through it and be healed. I mean, that is actually the real ideal of it. Most of us, though, what happens is we get wildly attracted to someone. We then go into that honeymoon phase. And please do remember that if you do not see the other person very often, that honeymoon can last for years. Because when we don't see the other person a lot, that means that we only ever put our best self forward. Okay, so if you don't only see them on dates, only occasionally, what I always say, try to go on holiday with this person as fast as possible, because you will see their true sense and their true sense of self as well. Most of the time, we really only get to know someone when we live with them, when we work with them, when we spend a significant amount of time with them. So let's recap. You get attracted to somebody with the same core wound, but the opposite expression of it. Then you get pulled from a chemical body perspective into the honeymoon period, and that's for you to bond. That is very purposely done so, for you to bond. But what happens in that honeymoon period, you're not really seeing the real person. Because in the beginning, when you know somebody very, very little, you know a bit of that person's true self. The rest of the picture you have made up in your mind. And that's why infatuation is such a high, really, is because it's not based on truth. It's based on the assumption of who you think that person is, based on the very little that you know of them. And that's why, because in reality, every human being has as much darkness as light, as many benefits as drawbacks, and as many highs and lows. Every single human being has two sides, yin and yang. You'll see that in the corner over there, my yin and yang side. That is because it is the universal law. Every single person, every single event, everyone you will ever meet in your life will have both light and dark. When we first get to know someone, it's not that we truly know them, we step into that assumption. Most of the time, the assumption is that they're only good, that they're only light, that they're only benefit, that they're only whatever your assumption is made. Then, as you truly start to get to know that person, and as their light and dark comes into balance, at that point, there is the opportunity for true love. But true love is not the high of the infatuation. True love is when you can see the person in their infinity as having both equal light and dark, and that you love them for the entirety of it. Think about it. Think, for instance, a hobby that you really like. Think of the cost that comes with it. Think of the inconvenience that comes with it. You still love it because of the whole. Not in spite of it, but because of it. You love the whole of that person. And so a lot of people confuse the fact that they think that actually the beginning part is real love, where it's not actually. The beginning part of knowing someone is infatuation, because you don't truly know them. Real, true love can only happen at the point where you can tell and see that that person has exactly the right amount of light and dark, and within their light is darkness, and within their darkness there's light. So when you see that person for their totality, that's when you are then invited and able to step into a true space of love. But here's the cracker, here's the problem. Most human beings completely, utterly, and divinely miss that moment, because they think that infatuation is true love, and when you actually see the whole of that person, they feel a sense of being left down, because now that person shows their light and the dark at the same time. But that's exactly the point, where at that point you have the opportunity to step into true intimacy, true connection, which is not at all a constant high. It is not at all only daisies, only bright side, because the truth is that a relationship is the combination of two people's values, of two people's perspective, of two people's perception, of two people's pain, past, trauma, childhood, the whole caboodle. That is not always going to be daisies and flowers and happiness, because what you need to do is come together from into that point from a perspective of honoring yourself and honoring the other person at the same time. And for most human beings, that is incredibly hard to do. You guessed it, because of the ego. Now, I'm not one of those ego bashing people at all. Your ego is that part of yourself that protects itself, that is designed to make sure that you don't jump off cliffs, put your hand into fire. The problem is when you've had a lot of trauma in your childhood, that ego becomes trigger happy. And that's when most of the time, unless you've worked a lot at yourself, gone into awareness, personal work, therapy work, you will not be able to control that ego. And so you will not be able to meet that person at an equal present point, because your ego will be the loudest thing. And the way that that pans out is you'll find other people are very defensive or aggressive or narcissistic, or the entire spectrum, because it is a spectrum. When the ego, on the other side of the spectrum is when you don't have enough of an ego, then you become a doormat and a people pleaser. So it's a true spectrum. But the point that's really important here is that the spiritual purpose of a relationship is also for you to step into the arena of another person's life, another person's needs, another person's perspective, and respect and honor it as much as your own. It's a process called differentiation. It's a fancy word basically saying that for you to truly be in a state of divine intimacy and deep connection, the skill that you need to develop is to be able to manage both your own sense of self and the other person, not making them more important or you more important. So if you're selfless, you've made the other person more important. Then you've got a wonky balance. If you're too much in the sense of self, if you're too in your ego, then it's the other way around. It's that fine point where you learn through relationships to be able to manage that midpoint. So the first thing that we did is the spiritual purpose of a relationship is to show you your core wound. And that is so fascinating by itself, because we all have a core wound. None of us get to live life without that core wound. And as a result, we go out into the world with that core wound and we start having patterns of behaviors, especially with regards to attachment and relationships and coping mechanisms. So one of the key things to become aware of is what your attachment style is. There is an amazing book called Attached. The authors are Levine and Heller. It's an amazing book all around. It will show you exactly whether you are anxiously attached or whether you are avoidantly attached. Most of us fall in one of the two categories. And that's because we all come from the same core wound, and then two different ways of dealing with it is either withdrawing yourself from love, which is avoidant, or going towards it, needing, codependency, that is anxiously attached. So there is a third group called secure, and most narcissists like to think that they're secure, but it is unbelievably rare. You would have had to have the most perfectly loving, educated, consciously, emotionally aware childhood where nothing ever went wrong. But here's the thing is your journey through your core wound, your journey through your pattern of attachment, your journey through your coping mechanism and becoming aware of it, that is your spiritual journey. Because that's when you become aware that you're not just trapped in your mind, you're not just trapped in your trauma, you're not just trapped in your habits. That's why awareness is so key. Self-awareness is the absolute cornerstone of making relationships work, because it's so easy to stand on the castle of your high and mighty opinions and look down on the other one and go, well, you do this and you do that and you do that. By the way, John Gottman, he has written the most amazing books. He's a PhD in psychology. He calls it the 4 horsemen of relationships apocalypse. I'm going to attach that document in the comments below. It is amazing. So the first is criticism, defensiveness. The third one is stonewalling. I can't remember the fourth one. But I mean, it's basically, if there's 4 things that you are doing consistently, criticizing, being contemptuous, being defensive, you are literally poisoning your relationships. These 4 behaviors are absolutely relationship poison. Also, if you're quite an aware person, when you see these 4 behaviors in another person, you know that they have no emotional capacity and relationship skills to meet you where you need to be met. And educating them is also probably not your job, but more about that later. So let's recap. The first point is the spiritual purpose of a relationship is to connect you with your core wound. And that usually happens when you've met, you've fallen in love, which is actually an infatuation. And then the real world eventually kicks in, depending on whether you live with each other, see each other often. And that is the point at which the other person is going to start triggering your core wound. Now, the core wound can be something like not feeling good enough, like abandonment, like not believing in yourself. Our core wound is individually based to your specific spiritual journey. But here's the cracker, and I love this. When I work with my clients, especially couples that come to me, I ask both parties to write down a piece of paper, if only my partner was more ... And every time when you look at what the person has written and when they then exchange it and read it, is the thing that your partner criticizes or sort of would like to change in you the most or struggles with you the most is exactly your spiritual journey. Do it as a laugh. It is really, truly, amazingly like enlightening. Is ask your partner to write down if only you were ... more, and you write down if only you would ... and then exchange and read it, because it is always and completely and utterly on point. I think if I look at my own relationships in the past, definitely most of the people that would have said, if Stephanie was more independent, more taking care of herself, and 9 out of 10 times, because you're generally in the same pattern over and over again, and also because you generally attract the same kind of person to help you heal that wound over and over again. So as a people pleaser, I generally, as an anxious attached people pleaser in attachment theory, I generally attracted avoidant people who were very, very independent, who wanted me to be more independent, and I wanted them to be more emotionally connected. So I used to, if I had written this down, I would have always said, I want the other person to be more emotionally present, more aware, and more connected to me. And guess what? That would have been their spiritual journey. So for a second, imagine that all your exes were lined up and we were handing them all little pieces of paper, and they would write down, if only he or she was more ... because that is a true gift. It is a true gift when you can really take that on and go, wow, you know what? That is so true. So for instance, in my core wound, most of my exes would have said, Stephanie should be more independent, less emotionally attached. And that comes from my core wound, because my core wound is the fear that just me is not enough, that just me is not good enough. So finding out your core wound and then looking at the pattern that you've gotten into in order to cope with it and what kind of an attachment you have, it's like going on a treasure hunt inside of your life and your relationships. Okay, let's move on. Another reason that why relationships are so unbelievably useful as a spiritual tool is because you get attracted in and you want to be that with that person. You're in love with them, you love them, and as a result the universe has no better way to making you put up with the difficulty of having to face your wound, having to face your spiritual journey, because that's what relationships bring out. Because when we go into them, we're stripped bare, we're stripped naked emotionally, and as a result there is no running, there is no hiding. You will be confronted with your core wound. That's also one of the things that I really, absolutely loathe about social media, those quotes, because there's this idea that when you meet the right person, that everything will be hunky-dory. That is not true. That is just not true at all. It's like the real juice of relationship comes from leaning into the difficulty, not legging it as soon as it becomes difficult or inconvenient or uncomfortable. That is the point where you then have to harness your energy, rail in your ego and say, you know what, I am unbelievably uncomfortable right now. I would love to just leg it, but my commitment is to stay connected to you and sort this out. That is the making of true relationship, of true connection, of true intimacy. Most people think intimacy is this thing that happens when two people are, have the right chemistry or are physically aligned. No. Anybody can do the honky wonky by numbers. True intimacy comes via the emotional element of facing difficulty and tension and disconnection and getting back to connection. Dr. David Snarch wrote an amazing book about this. Also, Esther Perel, amazing author. It's called Mating in Captivity. They talk about this whole misconception that true intimacy is all about, physical chemistry and combat. It's not. It's about emotionally leaning into your partner when really you just want to leg it and not have to deal with what's coming up. Okay. Relationships come, this is another one of the spiritual purpose. Relationships come to break you open. Because when we grow up and there's our core wound and then we step into our coping mechanism, we then get into habits of doing the same things over and over, whether that's a certain type of relationship, a certain type of ending of a relationship, a certain type of person even, you get into a habit. You will repeatedly run into that pattern over and over and over again until the lesson is learned, until the awareness has come into place. And unless unless you go into that higher echelon and looking at your life with awareness and from a third person perspective, and most people are unable to do that without great training or the help of a coach. Only then when you can say, okay, I can see, here's me, and I'm the common denominator in all of these relationships. What did they all have in common? What were they all trying to teach me? Every relationship, no matter how disastrous it was, has brought you a gift. And until you can be in that state and say, okay, I'm grateful for this gift, I'm grateful for that lesson, I can see the purpose of that relationship, you will attract the same thing over and over and over and over again. Because until you've learnt it, it just can't release you from that cycle. Because the universe's highest interest is balance, is healing, is wholeness. Your body is designed to heal itself. That's why relationships aren't just there for you to have a good time. The universe has very specifically organized relationships to be this almost bittersweet concoction of, on the one hand, wanting to be with that person, and on the other hand, having to face the wound that arises out of that union, which is, it is when you start looking at it from that other perspective, from that whole awareness, it is just such a magnificent, beautiful design. Because what the universe does, it brings together two people with the same core wound, with the opposite coping mechanism, but with perfect opposing strengths and weaknesses. So the way I want you to think about it is two little birds are hooked together in the arm and they have opposite broken wings. Because together, when they hook together and when they fly with their one good wing, they are then airborne. They are then on the way up. So this is what we do though, is here's the one person, here's the other person. This person stands in their strength. This person stands in their strength. They both stand on the high and mighty tower of ego, and they look down on the other person and they say, well, you're not organized. And the other person says, well, you're not emotionally connected. And so it's this tit, tat, what they both don't realize that actually, I can't do it, that actually they have opposing strengths and opposing weaknesses that when they come together, they will make each other whole. But what that requires is both people to come out of the high tower of their ego and step down into their own core wound of their child and then meet the other person as their wounded child. So if this person says, you should be more organized, rather than just standing on the high tower, come down into the humility and go, how would you say that if this person was a child? Because actually, your strength is there to guide, to mold, to mentor, and to help the other person's wounded inner child to rise into the adult. But here's what most people do. They sit on the high tower and they start criticizing, bad-mouthing, being, derogatory about the other person's weakness, not realizing that not only do they have themselves a great big whopping weakness, but that the other person has the opposing strength to them. Because we both come to relationship with exactly the correct and perfectly aligned opposing strengths and weaknesses. So here's a little exercise I'd like you to do right now in a relationship, perhaps in a relationship you're having difficulty with, whether that's a friendship, a business relationship, or a romantic relationship. Write down what are each other's strengths, what are each other's weakness, okay? And then realize that your strength is here to mold, to guide, to mentor, and to heal the other person's inner wounded child. So what would you not do? Scream at them, shout at them, insult them, criticize them, because you would never do that with a child, would you? But at the same time, the other person has to come into that awareness as well and understand that their strength is there to guide and mold and mentor your weakness and your wound. Because that's the spiritual purpose of relationship, is to come to a place of wholeness. Of wholeness, not as in you complete me, I complete me through you. That's really, really important. I complete me through you. And at the end of the day, what is always an amazing, amazing, amazing lesson in every situation when you go into a relationship is how good are you at loving yourself? Because if you're in that spectrum where you're just giving up on yourself, up on yourself, up on yourself, guess what? You will attract that same scenario over and over and over again. Usually if you are in a position where you give up on yourself all the time, you will attract bullies, you will attract people that leave you. Every single event that comes into your life is going to push you back further into yourself. Until you do that willingly and completely and naturally from the inside out. But that's something you need to be taught. Likewise, if you're very high in your ego, if you're very self-absorbed or very righteous or very defensive, and not because you're a mean person, but because this is what the trauma has caused in you, then you will constantly attract people who will walk out on you, say that I've had enough, and detach from you. Because when you are high in your ego, eventually people will just go, you know what, go do your thing because I just can't be bothered. So it's a spectrum. Both sides are a spectrum. Dr. John DeMartini always says there's careful, caring, and careless. So people that are very people pleasers and give up on themselves, they are in the careful. They're constantly around eggshells because they're anxiously attached. They need the attachment. On the flip side, people who are careless, generally avoidantly attached, people that are quite strong in their self-sense, almost egoic, and then higher on the echelons, narcissistic, defensive, things like that, hyper overprotective, well, guess what happens to them? Nobody wants to hang out with you if you're like that. In nature, if you are highly volatile, that means that no tribe will come to you. David Attenborough says that the organism that is least likely to be adapted to its surroundings will be cast out and not survive. And that happens to the same in human beings. So I hope I've given you a really nice general overview of the spiritual purpose of relationships. It is about facing your core wound. It's about meeting the other person in the middle, where you can look after your own boundaries and needs as well as theirs. So the idea that if you move from codependent, you must move into a place of independence first before you can come back to interdependence, the infinity sign, because that is truly relationships. Because it's not about all the other person or all about yourself. It has to be that sweet spot in the middle. Clearly, that is only reached through proper, consciously communicating with the other person. And that is only possible if you have a boatload of awareness. And that's something that you need to be taught. Relationships always give you a lesson, a message, and a blessing and a gift. And until you really step into that, so you go back and you look at that relationship and you really understand what the purpose, what the message and the blessing and the lesson and the gift of that was, guess what? You're going to attract it over and over again. I'm sure you've heard what you resist persists. So what you don't want keeps happening, and what you follow flees. So what you really desperately want doesn't come in. Why? Because you haven't learned the lesson. Because you're in a state of imbalance about that particular person, that particular event, or just going, oh, well, all these relationships, they just failed. They were just awful. That's not the case. They were the right relationship at the right time for your journey towards the highest expression of who you are and who you were born to be. Sometimes those relationships last a very, very long time. Sometimes they're really short time. Sometimes friendships can be more significant than romantic relationships, but you are never, ever, ever with the wrong relationship. Ever. And I do mean that also from a perspective, if you are in a relationship that is, heaven forbid, physically dangerous, emotionally abusive, you were meant to go through that, to develop. I don't wish it upon anyone, but the truth is darkness comes to teach us. Darkness comes to enlighten us. It's not that any relationship, no matter how volatile and difficult, of course, your job is to learn to self-care and put yourself into a place of safety. And I have worked with a lot of people who were in really, really harmful relationships. And they all said to me once we finished working that they realized that because of the trauma in their childhood, they hadn't yet made any boundaries. But here's the interesting thing. By somebody pushing your boundaries over and over and over again, you develop boundaries, and eventually you get to that point. And they all said that actually they can see, although that the relationship was difficult and traumatic, and I know that is very, very, very difficult to hear if you've had a very classically trained understanding of difficult relationships. I've been in my fair share, both physically and emotionally unideal situation, and I can guarantee you that they all had a purpose, because they all pushed me back further into myself. So going through them, in a sense, being bullied by these people, in childhood and in adulthood is because I came out of my childhood without a sense of self, without an understanding of where my boundaries are, without even understanding what codependence meant or what people pleasing was. I didn't know that I was doing it. I just thought, why do I keep attracting people that are mean, that are bullies? It's because when I didn't have a boundary, and as a result being pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed over my lifetime, I developed the strength to say, this is not for me. I don't like this. I don't want that. Because that's the power and the lesson and the blessing and the gift of relationships. I hope you can get an insight of that tonight. If you want to work further on this, and if you really want to get, and here's is a real gem, is if you're currently in a situation where you're single, please sit down and write out what the purpose, the message, the blessing, the lesson, and the gift was of each relationship that you were in, so that you can step into this new space. If you are currently in a relationship, go to the depth of this relationship, understand its dynamic. I guarantee with you that you will see this relationship, even if currently you are annoyed with it, you will see it from a different perspective. Also, if you're currently in a difficult relationship, see its lesson and then make the decision to move. Because it's only usually when you've come to a place of awareness about what this is trying to show you or teach you or highlight about your core wound. This isn't about being weak. This isn't about, not choosing well. These relationships have the power to break us open into awareness and back into our heart. And that is all I have for tonight. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. And keep them coming, your questions. I absolutely love them. And tell me what you thought about this topic and what your experience is of the spiritual purpose of relationships. Bye.